sometimes pivots take time.
Yes.
And we're planting the seeds, but you have to let the seeds start to grow.
With transformational change like that, it just doesn't happen overnight. It looks so easy on that piece of paper.
It is not linear progression, but like life isn't a linear progression.
Hi, welcome to Make Minutes Matter. I'm Karen Gilhooly, host of our podcast today, and today I'm with Heather Bellini, president and CFO of a firm called InvestCloud, which is located here in New York City.
That's right. Thanks for having me.
Yes. This is actually the first time I'm sitting with Heather and going to have a chance to talk to her about her very interesting career path, which has had a lot of twists and turns. So Heather, I know that you started your career in a more traditional space,
right,
back at Goldman Sachs, if I remember correctly, correct?
So I started out of business school. I started out actually at Lehman Brothers, and
okay.
I was an associate there and moved around with my boss. You usually in research move with your senior. And I did that. I went from Lehman to Citigroup and ultimately had my own sector at that point, as we call it in research, and then moved to Goldman Sachs, which was the prior roughly 10 years before I made my next pivot.
Wow. Some interesting similarities there. So I started out in banking too, also at Citibank. I don't know that our careers necessarily intersected, but you mentioned something that I think is really important. So when you started, you had someone that was looking after you.
Right.
You had a mentor, someone
right.
that cared for you. Tell me a little bit about that and the difference that made to you.
It makes a big difference. And in fact, I was just speaking about this with my oldest daughter, who has an internship at an investment bank this summer in New York City, and talking to her about the power of mentorships, and sent her some articles and just talked about how it applied to me. But yes, I had an excellent gentleman by the name of Pat Burton, who was my senior analyst, who really instilled, a culture. It was like a work family, all of us on the team, and he would look out for me, and he would, make sure that I got recognition, and he wasn't always looking to take the recognition himself. And so I learned from that and have passed that through. And I think that's one of the things, if you were to talk to the people that report into me, I try and make sure they have that similar exposure, and I give them access to the CEO to ensure that they know how important they are to the organization. So
well, without them, it'd be very hard to get anything done.
It would be impossible.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Yes, we're only one piece of the puzzle. And the puzzle is incomplete without the other team members.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other piece of having a great mentor is that, especially when you're new, you don't know what you don't know. Right. And having someone to both model the behavior, to give you the advice, to give you a good poke when
right.
you're going down the wrong path, that is so invaluable.
Yeah, I think it's very valuable. And I think it changes what you need changes as your career expands. And so I would say, again, I've been very lucky to have mentors and managers or bosses that would give me that feedback. But, and then ultimately, I remember when I got promoted to partner at Goldman Sachs, one of the things they do is they bring in coaches for the partners, and they'll come in and say, look, maybe you have to think about acting this way. And they'll kind of observe your behavior. They'll talk to people around you about how they interact with you. And, there's always, it's kind of like having a personal trainer at the gym.
Yes.
It's having a personal trainer that helped, kind of shape, how I wanted to act, or how I would be, how I would get even more done and have greater impact if I would change certain behaviors. And so I learned a lot from that. And every now and then I could see myself dipping back and making some of those mistakes. And then you try and remember, and it's kind of trying to go for constant growth.
Yeah. That is interesting, because I think the coaching proposition might be the next level, if you will, of the mentorship component. And you don't see yourself in many cases. Other people see you,
right?
But you don't see yourself,
right?
And the idea of opening yourself to feedback. Tell me a little bit about that. That can be. I've gone through this too. I know what it feels like.
I still have very good friends that are there and colleagues that we would banter around. And, there's perception and there's reality. And perception is something that you have to live with, and it takes time. Perception takes time to change. So you might have changed your behavior, but the perception might lag by 6 months. And so it's that, again, it's kind of like working out or eating better. Sometimes it takes a while to see the benefits of the changes in your habits. And so that's probably one of the things that can be frustrating at times, as you say, well, I've changed that, but it hasn't been enough time. And people need to interact with you on a regular basis so that they can see that happen. And so I think sometimes you just have to be a little bit patient that, again, perception does lag reality. I think it's a great thing to go through. And what's also interesting is I think, sometimes feedback, perception for women, same behavior, but a perception for a female would be different than that same behavior, how it would be perceived if you were male. And so that's some of the, kind of unconscious biases, if you will, that you've just learned, and I've learned over time, just being female in a male-dominated business.
Yes, absolutely. And I can remember actually going to an executive course on that particular issue where, as women, it's a lot harder for us to give feedback to one another than it is for men to give feedback to each other. So I just think that's kind of an interesting phenomena. And I hadn't really thought about it until it was presented this way, that men typically will just say, knock it off, or they don't worry about the feeling side of things. They just lay it on the line, and then you either tough it up or you move on. And whereas women don't necessarily do that. Now, I get a sense that you're probably more open to feedback than many, and I am too.
I've never had a female boss. Mm-hmm. So I've never had a female giving me, a review or feedback like that. But yeah, no, I mean, and part of it is perception matters. Mm-hmm. You might think you're perceived one way, but what matters is what other people think of you if you're trying to influence and have an impact and get people to move together. So yeah, I would say if you were to ask our current CEO or our CEO, Jeff Yabuki, he would say, yeah, I'm pretty open to feedback. I remember, I tell the story, the day I got promoted to partner at Goldman, like the next day I came into the office, I was traveling the day before, and they sit down with you and they gave you a list of things that you needed to improve upon. And I laughed because my kids were, I think, 6 and 9 or something like that at that point. And it was as long as their Christmas list.
Oh my goodness.
And you're like, God, I don't know how I got promoted if this is all the things I have to do better. And they're like, no, this is what we think you can do. And so that type of feedback, that's how we get better.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. And how great is that to say this is something that it's not like it's off the charts. It's just and not existent. It's just something that you can build on and be better. And I think that if more people could open their mind to feedback being exactly that, an opportunity to do something better.
Right.
Because giving somebody feedback takes a little bit of effort, and it takes a little bit of courage too.
Right.
And it's a lot easier just to say nothing than it is to actually share.
It is. But if you think about the role, I always say I have a sister who's a doctor and she used to run the resident program. And so I would, she would say, like, I'm training the next generation of doctors, right? So yes, I could do things faster and better if I just did it myself. But if I train, the job is to train them. Part of the job is to train them. And then you generate the future of doctors. And it's the same in any business, right? My role, and Goldman was very big on this, and I agree with it, is to hire your replacement. You don't want people on your team who you don't think could take your job, because it then just limits you from getting your next opportunity.
That's exactly right.
That's one thing that they definitely instilled in us is make sure that you're keeping talent on your team that's good enough to replace you. And that could be scary. Mm-hmm. You have to have that confidence that, if they did replace you with someone, you'd land somebody somewhere else or they'd find another home for you. And, I think that's something that I very much took with me from Goldman and brought to where I am now, is that the hope is that, and I say to them, like, look, hopefully one of you will replace me at some point. And they'll say like, well, what does that mean about you? I'm like, I'll move on to something else, right? Maybe I'll spend more time just being president or whatever. So you should always be thinking of growth. No one should ever be happy status quo forever.
Yeah. And I think some of that comes from both the path that you took. So I think that you probably found some of that foundation when you were at the earlier banks, certainly Citibank, Goldman, this whole idea of exceptionalism, trying to be your best, to surround yourself with great talent, and to look for ways to deploy that as well as thinking about where you want to go.
Right.
I think that's part of the culture.
Yeah, I would agree.
So I wanted to go back to the coaching piece for just 1 second, and then we'll move on. You've likened it to a personal trainer, working out at the gym, losing weight, eating better. And all of those things have one thing in common, which is the discipline.
Right.
The discipline and the commitment to actually follow through. So tell me any tips maybe for our audience on it, not just thinking about it, but actually moving things into action.
I just think it's about routine. Do you like routine? If you do, then I think discipline can be easier. But then if you get out of your routine and you get comfortable with that, then it's hard to get back in. So I just think it's constantly trying to me, it's probably more about time management and just making sure you know when you could block off certain things and try and fit in. And you can't do everything all the time, but trying to make sure you find the time to also help yourself recharge if that's what you need by going to the gym. I mean, that's where I get great ideas when I was as a research analyst or in my role now, and I'll fire off emails to my CEO afterwards and say, I was just on the treadmill and I thought of this. And so like, that's what the time I use to, kind of make sure my mind can kind of wander. And it usually will wander to something that I need to get done or an idea or something that we haven't thought about that maybe we need to think harder about. And, so I think it's trying to merge those together. But to me, the discipline's just really about routine. Yeah.
And you've raised a really good point that I think would be certainly helpful to our listeners, but also helpful to me as you're talking about this. Where is the place where you have that decompression opportunity? Where is that? And for me, there are two places. When I'm driving, which sometimes is not really a great idea to be zoning out, but when I'm driving, I get a lot of great ideas because especially if I'm in the car by myself, it's just me and I'm focused on the road, of course, but in the back of my head, I'm going through, this issue or that issue. And then the second place is in the shower. When I'm I love to take a really hot shower. And I have to tell you that most of my great ideas have come when I'm standing and steaming. The bathroom's got all the little condensation all over the place. Somebody will walk in, what the hell has been going on in here? And say, well, I've been thinking up great ideas. Oh, crazy. So tell me a little bit about your decision to move away from the traditional, where it sounded like you had a great foundation, and then go to do what you're doing.
And I had people who I really respect and people I worked with prior go do the same thing, leave from a similar path as me and go corporate, which is what we call it, right? Leaving from the equity research side to go corporate. So a lot of people that have had really successful careers, kind of as they did that. And for me, when people ask me, I usually, I would describe it as this. When you're in equity research, an investment bank, I would say you're kind of like a food critic, right? So I go to a restaurant, I sample the food, I have a drink, and I'm like, I like this, I don't like that. That has too much salt, too little spice. When you go corporate, you become to me, I think of myself as the sous chef to the CEO. And so now I'm actually helping to make the food. And so what ingredients do I put in? How do I change the recipe? So I wanted to go from being a food critic to a sous chef. And so I went from watching to doing. So watching and giving advice is different than actually doing the role. And it's interesting because the company I'm at is a private equity backed company, and my current CEO, Jeff, is also the chairman of the private equity company.
Oh, wow.
And one of the things that we talk about often is that it would be great. The investment professionals, whether it's at a private equity firm or a venture capital firm, would actually, in my opinion, be much better investors if they actually went corporate for a few years and had to do a stint, because you learn, like an Excel model is, to me, it's three-dimensional. But if you just work on the investing side and you've never done corporate, it's two-dimensional.
Right.
Because there's not just numbers in a cell or formulas in a cell. There's thought behind why that formula is there. And on the other side, it's just a number in a cell that you're just kind of making hey, well, historically, this has always happened, but you don't know why that's happened.
Yeah.
And so that's been a really interesting journey for me to be able to take what I learned from the research side, apply it on the corporate side, and then to see, what that would mean and how I talk to the private equity people as well, because I'm also an industry partner at the private equity company, to help them with, hey, I would actually ask these questions, maybe not those questions.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's incredible insight, because you're exactly right. When you are on the outside looking in, you only see a perspective. It's
right.
Like the restaurant analogy is perfect. The other one that I would use is, so I spend a lot of time in my life, and I suspect you have as well, on an airplane. And the travel experience for someone who just travels once in a while looks a certain way. But for somebody who's actually on a plane all the time, you get to see a little bit of the guts
right.
of how it works. And that additional insight really puts you in a position to influence and be able to take some level of control. So now that you're in the sous chef business, what are some of the interesting insights other than this 3D proposition? Anything else that you've learned?
Again, it's similar, right? It's instilling that. For me, before, we worked in really small teams.
Mm-hmm.
Now I've got much bigger teams. So how do you get that same level of engagement and relationships with people on a broader team where, your time is already being pulled in a million different directions, but you need to build the relationships with a broader team set? How do you do that? It's a different level. You maybe can't be. When I ran a team of, my immediate team at Goldman was like 4 or 5 people, but it was a broader, since I ran their tech research practice, maybe there were 80 people overall, but like I was really close with the direct team members I had, plus the senior members of the other teams.
Right.
But so now I'm leading a group of probably 90 people, right? So how do you foster that same culture and connection with people when it's such a broader group? So I would say that's something that's different, that takes trial and error, to be honest. That's been one of the bigger things. And also that it takes time, right? So as we make changes to the business or suggest changes to the business, it's, having the patience to see through those results, to see the results start to come through. And that goes back to what I said before. It's like perception versus reality, right? So getting people to understand, like, sometimes pivots take time.
Yes.
And we're planting the seeds, but you have to let the seeds start to grow.
I agree with you completely. And with transformational change like that, it just doesn't happen overnight.
It does not.
Yeah, and it looks so easy on that piece of paper.
It does.
Yeah.
It is not linear progression, but like life isn't a linear progression. So
no, it's not.
Yeah.
Wow. What a great conversation with Heather Bellini. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll uncover even more interesting insights about Heather's fabulous career journey.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Make Minutes Matter. If you haven't done so already, please take a moment to subscribe to this podcast on YouTube or click the follow button on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And let me know what you thought of today's conversation by following us on Instagram at Karen Gilhooly 1. That's Karen, Karen, Gilhooly, Gilhooly, and the number 1. Let's make every moment in your career truly matter. Have a great day.